Welcome to another edition of eNCA's Bookshelf. Today, we are looking at the Profiler Diaries from the case files of a police psychologist. It's a look at some of the most terrifying and intriguing cases. Former SAPS head professor, Dr. Gérard Labuschagne. Joining me now is the author himself, Mr. Labuschagne, eNCA's book club members, Mabutho, Ngcobo, and Nkosazana, Dambuza. Thank you very much, guys, for your time. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Labuschagne. I don't know, are you also comfortable if I just call you Gérard? Because I've had authors saying, please just refer to me with my first name. So this book was very interesting for me because I think my colleagues will probably understand what I mean, and I'll come back to them, because I've always been interested in journalism, so I would either read about certain court cases, and then during my career I've attended many court cases, so it put me through your eyes. You know, when I'm sitting in court, I'm just listening to the witnesses, and you would probably be a witness in court. But this time, I get to really see what it was that you were going through during the times you had to interview these criminals.
Yeah, I think that's what I was sort of aiming for, and that's why I called it the Profiler Diaries, because I wanted it to be kind of like the backstory of what it was like on the inside. You know, our frustrations, our difficulties, the things that you don't hear about on the outside as to what we found frustrating, from politics to internal dynamics to, you know, other policemen not doing their job correctly, you know, which is the thing that many people in society experience. So that was kind of the aim of the whole way I wanted to write this particular book, which is why I didn't want to write it with another journalist. You know, I felt I needed to have it come out sort of my own words.
And I think that was pretty interesting, because that was the first thing that you mentioned in the book, that, you know, I've had a lot of people, even, I think you mentioned Jacques Poe, coming to you to say, hey, listen, you've retired, let's write a book. And you thought, no, I need to do this myself.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of reasons. I mean, those offers, I mean, it was really a lot of great journalists who came forward and said, look, I'd like to write it with you, and that's fantastic. You know, I really appreciated that. I think a couple of things. It wasn't the right time for me. I think at that point I was so burnt out and I wanted to get away from all of this. You know, I didn't even want to speak to my colleagues from the unit who had been my closest friends for 14 or so years. And it really was a question of I needed the time away from it, and I never knew when I would actually get to it, if I would ever. And as I said, wanting to tell it from my own words as opposed to altered through someone else's perceptions.
I want to speak to Nkosazana. Nkosa, you know, when you hear Mr. Labuschagne refer to the burnout, you know, this is something that I, as a journalist, have actually experienced, believe it or not, Gérard, where I've covered so many sad stories about, or I've covered a criminal court case, like a horrifying one. And unlike you, I wouldn't have seen the actual scene. But I become so disengaged after covering such stories. Nkosa?
Absolutely, Masego, I agree with you there. And in fact, there's a question that I want to pose to Gérard. You know, as a law student myself, obviously I'm very intrigued by the criminal justice system that we get to learn a lot from in this book, you know, all the way from the commission of the crime right through to the prosecution stage, which is very interesting and sometimes chilling and very terrifying. For me, I was very intrigued by the fact that you were able to interview one-on-one serial killers. I mean, for a journalist and for myself as a law student as well, that is a dream. But like Masego said, you know, there comes a time where you just have to emotionally detach yourself. And for me, I just really want to pose this question to you. How were you able to emotionally disconnect yourself from the person, the criminal that committed the crime, and the actual crime? How was that emotional process for you?
Yeah, I think what helps in that getting distance, and I think that's for journalists, you know, frontline policemen, etc., is I think for me, I looked at it as from almost like a research point of view, which is fascinating to meet these people. So there's a curiosity angle to it. And also just keeping in mind that my role is to help try and bring some justice for the victim, their family, and I suppose broader society. And that perhaps, in a way, helped me keep a bit of a clinical distance to it. It's never 100% possible to do that. I'm sure you've also experienced in your own line of work. But I think always fascinated by human behavior, which is why I became a psychologist, perhaps did give me that ability to keep a bit of a distance. And there were some cases where that was easier, some cases where that was less easy. And I think, but you can't always fight off this accumulative effect of years and years and years. And I often sort of said, though, it wasn't so much, you know, what I saw, and I never really had nightmares about what I was seeing, but it was the amount of work. we were literally working almost 20 hours a day. I'd have 1 or 2 nights every month where I just wouldn't sleep, and I'd work straight through because I couldn't sleep and I had too much work to do. I think that the organizational frustrations of working in any large organization was really what I felt kind of ground me down towards the end. I think basically the sort of hoping to look at it from a clinical point of view helped me keep a bit of distance.
Mabutho, let's talk about why Gérard actually became a psychologist. He's so honest in his book, talking about, I found it very honest, talking about how badly you did in high school in terms of your report, getting Fs and Ds. You're not the only one. And, he talks about why he became a psychologist, but I think also the guide from his mother, Mabutho.
Yes, indeed. I saw that part. I mean, I told myself that actually this writer is very, very honest because, not so many people can just come out and just, tell the world that, look, this is what I was at school, I was not good and stuff like that. But, in this book, he's just honest, he's just telling it the way it is. But then it also speaks to the issue of lack of guidance in many schools because you can see that the author is saying that he was not good at school, but then later on, he's a writer, he's a good investigator. So it also speaks to that issue of having good guidance in schools. But overall, when it comes to the book, I must say that initially, when I realized that the author is a PhD holder, I thought that probably it would be one of those book with convoluted sentences, those PhD that they normally do when they write those theses and for those academic journals. But I find the book quite written in a simple language, and from time to time there are some parts where we are given snippets that this is what you're going to expect in the next part. So I really enjoyed reading the book.
And talking about the type of writing, Mabutho, I think also it's the fact that you find some humor. I mean, in a book like this, I don't know if the viewers can be shown this book. You look at this book, there's like blood prints on it, a hand with blood on it, and you just see the Profiler Diaries. You know that it's one of those books that will be depressing, but he puts quite a lot of humor in it. What I found funny as well, Mabutho, is that poor woman that inherited your number after you retired. I think that was very funny for me because I think as journalists also, when you leave a company, your number might be inherited by someone else and your sources will call those people. But this poor woman had to filter calls from drunk police officers, I believe, and some of the people that you interviewed and gave your numbers.
Yeah, I think touching on the humor, I think that's also what was mentioned earlier. How do you sort of keep a distance? And I think in this, any kind of frontline sort of work like journalism, paramedics, etc., I think you do have the sort of gallows humor which helps keep a bit of distance. And I do think by nature I like to see the lighter side of life, not that this work I didn't take seriously, but if you don't have that ability to sort of see the positive in life, the good things, and have a bit of a chuckle at whether it's at yourself or what's happening to you, etc., it does make it really difficult to sort of keep that a bit of distance. As for schooling, I think school doesn't, school's not the best thing for everybody in the sense that it doesn't match people's way of thinking, way of understanding, way of learning, and interests. And I think I was one of those people that kind of fell through the cracks. I didn't really find school interesting in terms of what my needs were. Then I started to think maybe I'm not really very smart. And I just found that as soon as I got into university and I was doing what I wanted to do, I mean, it was just a totally different ballgame, and I started to do very well because it just really piqued my interest. And I think that's the difficulty. We have a system that, is made for the majority of people, and people fit in that to a greater or lesser degree. And I also don't think I knew how to study. I didn't know how to actually physically learn, which I actually only really learned to do at university. So a lot of combination of things that sort of made it easier for me as life went on academically.
I think I want to bring in my colleagues as well, Mabutho and Nkosazana. There's a lot in the book that you would actually resonate with as a journalist because, for instance, early in the book you speak about you were the weird division. The weirder a case was, the better, and it shows just how we are desensitized, even us as journalists, because you hear things in the newsroom where people would say if it bleeds, it leads, because the weirder something is the way that the more we're interested, but it also speaks to society, because that's how you pull the reader or you pull the viewer when you have this strange story. And I think Jared speaks about an interesting case that it was the first time I heard of it in the book, of a sex worker who was murdered, and a business card was neatly folded and her hair put around it and then put inside her vagina. You know, Nkosa, I think you and Mabutho would agree that, you know, in every newsroom, when you find stories like this, it's the lead.
Indeed, it is. Like you correctly have said, that if it's bleed, it's lead. So definitely when you see a story like that. But then I also go to what I agree with you, that, you know, after going through all those kinds of things, what do you do? Do you get some sort of counseling? You know, the police, they go through a lot. So you wonder if they do get some sort of counseling, you know, because it's not easy. I mean, reading this book, you know, talking about people killing people like nobody's business, and there's blood all over the place. And you wonder if at the end of the day, do these people do get some sort of counseling, you know, because this is not an easy stuff, to be quite honest.
To tell you the truth, Jared, I would speak for a long time if I had to speak about this book, because it feels like many stories that I've covered in one book. So I'll speak for longer than 15 minutes, so I'm quite sad that we have to end it soon, just like I was sad when I reached the last page of this book. But you spoke to Jose da Silva, and I think you mentioned that this one was quite different, because you actually didn't speak to him like you would with other criminals from inside a prison with like guards around you. This time you were in his home alone. How did that feel?
Yeah, so Jose murdered an interior decorator in 2001.
With an axe.
With an axe, my very first crime scene I ever attended. It was along the Krugersdorp Highway where he left her body. And when he was arrested, I think about 6 weeks later, after very good police work by the investigating officer, Captain Pinar, they called me out and said, look, you know, come and interview him. I said, well, where are you? He said, well, we're at his house. I said, okay. So I, you know, got dressed. It was in the evening. I went to his house, and I ended up interviewing him actually in the bathroom where he had bludgeoned this woman to death. I was sitting on the edge of the bath. He was sitting on the sort of toilet, and had a chat to him for about an hour and a half, and starting from where he was from, telling me about his life, leading up obviously into the incident. So that was, again, one of the most unique environments that I've interviewed someone in. And I think just great work, because the police actually caught someone who was becoming a serial murderer, if you look at his pattern of behavior up until that point, after his first murder. And that's, you know, brilliant policing, to prevent someone from actually being able to become a serial murderer. And he himself actually said later on that if he hadn't been caught, he would have continued doing this. So I think that's on so many levels. My first crime scene, interviewed him in a unique environment, and of course, great work that actually stopped him from becoming a serial.
Nkosa, I don't know about you. Sometimes I found myself feeling jealous of Jared, thinking, oh, goodness, I would love to be that journalist that gets the scoop from the killer himself. You know, I found myself reading this, and I'm like, oh, gosh, I would be winning awards.
Absolutely, Masego. I did find myself very jealous quite a few times in the book. And I must say as well that him highlighting, you know, that the policing system in South Africa is not up to par coincides with a lot of the media reports that we as journalists have been publishing over the past year. I mean, I remember just not a month ago where I personally experienced, you know, police brutality. So I found that the publishing of the book was just absolutely perfect. And I want to ask Jared if that was intentional.
The question, as I said, when I left, I didn't want to write the book when I left. I needed that distance. I had no idea when I'd get to that point. And it kind of came to, I'd been out of the police since March 2016. COVID hit us all last year, and suddenly I work for myself now. I had nothing to do. And it kind of was a combination of available time to write it, psychologically being in the right space. So it wasn't any sort of pre-plan. It just sort of a whole bunch of things fell into place. And I think often say karma kicks in also, and maybe that's what you're saying, Nkosazana. It fitted into what we're seeing a lot now. And it was since I left the police that I've really noticed a lot of things just sort of, unfortunately, sort of crumbling away to some degree and eroding of a lot of our policing capabilities, whether it's the DNA debacle at the moment at the forensic laboratories, and a lot of frustration amongst my colleagues who are still in the police since I've left. It was just sad, and hopefully that can be sort of brought around with the right management.
So your first case was Jose's case, like you mentioned. And, you know, with your very first case, having no security around you, you are one person who's covered many other high-profile cases as well, and you had to get into the mind of somebody. You know, tell us how you were able to actually go through this and make, because you have to make the criminal feel as though you're on their side.
Yeah, I think it's, in a way, one often forgets, and I think I do say this in the book, that you know, we judge these individuals by the horrific acts they do, and I think that is quite rightly so from a criminal point of view and criminal justice point of view. But they are so much more than that. As I say in the book, you know, you're someone who's murdered 16 people, maybe he spends 2 hours doing each murder, that's 32 hours or whatever of his week, of his life. The other time, he's doing everything else that we have to do. He's got the same frustrations, difficulties, he's got a family he grew up in, which is good or bad, etc. So there's a lot more in some ways that we have in common with these individuals. And that's why I always thought my interviews by, tell me about who you are. What was your family like? How many siblings did you have? What was it like growing up? Were your parents divorced? What was school like? What were your relationships with people like? And often that just gives you, not only a bit of a rapport with the individual, but a bit of insight into what maybe played a role in getting us to where we are today, and I'm sitting in front of that person interviewing them. And I think once you start to do that, and I think with these types of criminals, your psychologically motivated crime criminals, this is the first time they can actually talk to anybody about what they've done. You know, cash and transit robbers often sit and brag to their colleagues and their other fellow cash and transit robbers what they're doing. People in the community know who they are very often, but these individuals don't have that luxury, so to speak. And to find someone who's prepared to try and understand them, as opposed to walking in there and just judging them for what they've done and tell them how sick they are, etc., and you're going to go to jail, I think they often find that as a unique opportunity to speak to someone. And of course, with the experience we built up with people who really have worked with a lot of these types of individuals, and that kind of insight often makes them open up to you a lot easier. And which is why a lot of these guys do confess. If you have the right kind of investigator who's been trained, for example, by my old unit, they often then have the ability to really just interview them in the right way to get them to open up and tell us about what they've done.
Which one is your worst case? Which one is the case that you said you didn't have nightmares because of the case, but which one is the case that made you go back home or to the office and just think, geez, this is...
You know, there are lots of cases that for different reasons have that. It could be a child who was murdered, a horrific Muti murder. I think the one that really always wanted to get solved the most badly out of all my cases was the case, and I think I do mention it briefly in the book, Andrea Fenter's murder. And unfortunately, literally I think it was 10 years ago now, on the 2nd of May, she was brutally murdered by her boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, and a long history of intimate partner abuse towards her. And there were so many failings in the justice system, from when she tried to take out protection orders, police not responding to the protection orders. He kills her, he gets arrested, he eventually gets bail overturned by the High Court, he then flees the country, we get him arrested in 2013 in Brazil, he then gets erroneously released by the Brazilian authorities a year or so later, and then we eventually track him down again in Brazil, and he gets brought back to South Africa last year during lockdown to stand trial. And his last appearance was just now this past Friday in court. And I just felt that it was so unfair to this young girl that the society that was there, supposed to be there to protect her, all the structures were just falling away and letting her down. Even in her death, she was let down. So that's why there was one that I felt, if there's one that I really want to see solved, it must be Gerard Janssen van Vuuren to be brought to answer for his crimes in a court of law and put forward his defense, and let, of course, an impartial judge make a decision as to what should happen with him. So that one really just grated me, and always I felt I really want to see that one solved. And the other ones, as I said, for little reasons that stood out for me.
Now, you speak about, you know, how police handle cases where they make mistakes at times, and I think Nkosazana also made mention to it. But you also mentioned somewhere in the book something that I must admit I was a bit surprised about, because we didn't get to have former Police Commissioner Nkosazana Patlane in that position for a long time, and by the time he went out, it wasn't very graceful in terms of what was written about him or said about him in the public. But you describe him as a very good leader, the smartest, you said, that you've ever seen.
Yeah, and of course the current problems he's facing, I think those are just going to have to go to court, and we're going to have an impartial body hear all sides and make a decision as to what he's done or what he hasn't done. And if he's done something wrong, obviously he'll be held accountable for that. But my experience of him was when he came into the forensics division from, I think, the human resources division, if I recall correctly. And we all thought, here's a guy who's got no forensic experience. He was a career policeman. He did start off, I think, at Klipgat police station, and then worked his way up very successfully. So we all thought he's going to step into the forensic environment and not know what to do. And really, he did turn the forensics division around in terms of performance, turnaround times, lowering backlogs, etc. And it was a nightmare to be under his command because he was a hard taskmaster. He held people accountable, and if you didn't do something, you were held accountable. And I just didn't see enough of that happening in the police. People make horrible mistakes and nothing happens to them, which means there's no self-correction. So I felt that as difficult he was as a boss, I felt that he would be a great person to be the national commissioner, a career policeman who really holds people accountable. I mean, his management meetings were a nightmare to sit through. And it was very sad later on to see what the accusations were, and then, of course, his exiting from the police, which, as I said, we'll have to see how that plays out in the courtrooms. But for me, I experienced him as a really great guy, and definitely one of the smartest generals. I'll stand by that today. One of the smartest generals I came across, because often what I seem to find is people will be promoted from a brigadier into a general position, and suddenly their brains would stop working. They wouldn't apply their minds. They would just kind of follow the lead of whatever the national commissioner said. And Labuschagne wasn't like that. And so I admired him for that. And sadly, as I said, we'll have to see how it all plays out.
Mabutho, while I was reading this book, actually, I found that Gérard was actually offering me counseling indirectly as a journalist, having to know that there's somebody who's experienced this at a more closer level than I have as a journalist. And he's basically saying things, I think you say, you cannot visit the depths of hell, but you can visit the depths of hell, but don't hang around there for too long. Did you find yourself experiencing some sort of psychology session from Gérard indirectly as well?
The sound is quite not clear at the moment, but I must say thank you to the author for introducing us to the world of the police, because many of these cases are cases that have been in public, but now we get to know what is it that the police do behind the scenes, because often police get to be criticized, when cases are not solved, when suspects are not arrested. We are often quick to criticize the police. But if you read this book, then you realize that there is a lot that they have to put together in order to, put together the evidence so that when they go to court, they have something credible, so that it's not torn apart when they appear there. So I think it's been quite very useful. I think every journalist, especially crime reporters and court reporters, they do need to have this book, and even members of the public in general, because, like I'm saying, we are always quick to say, hey, amapoisa wasebenzi, they're not doing their job. So it's always good to have some sort of inside information like this book is saying.
My last question to you, Gérard, before we have to go, is about, cold cases. A lot of people would say, well, if I die tomorrow and the person who killed me is not arrested, nothing's going to happen unless the media is called or civil society starts to push the police to do something.
Yeah, sadly, I think that's a common perception of an experience of people that, if you're the average person on the street, are you going to get justice? And unfortunately, it does just depend on whose table that case lands on. You get a wonderful constable who's a detective at Hillbrow Police Station who's going to do a great job because he or she is really motivated. But if it lands on the wrong person's table, or the crime scene guy isn't the best person or is not having a great day, that can affect the outcome of the case. And that, I think, is a frustration that even myself as a member of the police, because I also relied on other policemen to do their jobs. I rely on that uniformed guy who gets to the scene first, to coordinate off, perhaps get people's details who we can take statements from. I rely on the forensics lab. I rely on the crime scene people. So there's so many technical sides to an investigation that if it doesn't all work together, it really is very easy for it to fall flat. And that includes sort of the prosecuting authority. If you don't have a hard-working, good prosecutor, it doesn't matter how much great work you've done on the ground. So it really is a criminal justice system, and that's kind of the frustration. It relies on so many things to go well. And there are, as I said, there are brilliant policemen in the South African police that are there. But I think if you look at the organization as a whole, people feel this isn't a quality organization. If you say Toyota builds 1,000 cars a year, 10 which are fantastic and never break down, or 100 that never break down, but the other 900 do, how do you judge the brand? You judge it as not a good brand. And I think that's what the SAPS is suffering from, is a brand crisis. Because as an expectation, even when I walk into a police station, I dread it. I dread even having to go there to get something certified as a true copy. Because the attitude that you might get, and specifically knowing how people should be behaving, it's even more frustrating.
Okay, very quickly, they're telling me that I need to wrap up. I imagine whatever book you're reading now has nothing to do with crime.
Yes, I'm actually reading a book about Auschwitz. So unfortunately, another tragedy, but yeah, I tend not to read crime books.
All right, thank you very much, guys, for your time. This is obviously the book that we were looking at today, The Profiler Diaries by Gérard Labuschagne. It's a really good book, and like you heard from my colleague Mabutho Ngcobo, it's a good book to have not only as a journalist or a court reporter, but as the public as well, to just get a glimpse of what police go through. Thank you very much, Bookshelf Club members, Nkosazana Dambuza and Mabutho Ngcobo, as well as the author. Thank you for your time.